The most dangerous people are usually the ones who never feel the need to prove it. Nobody remembered who said those words first, but every old-timer inside Red Creek State Prison believed them, especially the ones who had survived long enough to know that appearances meant nothing behind steel doors. The transport bus rolled through the outer gate just after sunrise, its tires crunching over loose gravel while the watchtowers above stood silent against the pale Texas sky. Most mornings inside Red Creek started the same way. Guards changed shifts. Inmates lined up for breakfast. Somebody complained about the coffee. Somebody else counted the days until parole. But this morning felt different, though nobody could explain why. The bus came to a stop, and one by one, the new transfers stepped out wearing the same faded uniforms, carrying the same clear plastic bags that held everything they owned. Some looked nervous. Some tried to act tough. Some kept their heads down. Then the last man stepped onto the pavement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and somewhere in his mid-40s. His hair had started turning gray around the edges, and his face carried the kind of quiet that only came from a lifetime of difficult choices. He didn't look around. He didn't stare at the towers, or the razor wire, or the walls that stretched nearly 30 feet into the air. He simply stood there, waiting for instructions as though he had walked through places far worse than this. His file said his name was Elias Carter. His charge wasn't the kind that made headlines, and the paperwork attached to his transfer looked surprisingly thin. One of the younger officers frowned while flipping through the folder. "That's it?" he asked. The older correctional officer beside him shrugged. "That's all they sent." The younger man looked at Elias again. "Doesn't seem right." The veteran officer closed the file without another word. Around Red Creek, people learned not to ask too many questions. Inside cell block C, another routine was unfolding. Tommy Graves sat at the center table in the cafeteria, exactly where he sat every morning. The seat wasn't assigned by the prison. It belonged to him because nobody else was foolish enough to take it. For nearly 8 years, Tommy had ruled that block through confidence, reputation, and the simple understanding that crossing him usually led to a very bad day. His crew laughed at his jokes before he finished telling them. New inmates offered him favors without being asked. Even the loudest troublemakers somehow became quieter whenever Tommy walked by. "New fish coming today," one of his men said, setting down his tray. Tommy barely looked up. "Anything interesting?" "Just another transfer." Tommy smirked. "Then he'll learn the rules like everybody else." Across the room, a few older inmates exchanged glances. They had seen hundreds of new arrivals over the years, but rumors moved through a prison faster than wildfire, and somebody had already noticed the quiet man getting off the bus. One inmate leaned closer to another and whispered, "Did you see the way he walked?" The other nodded slowly. "Yeah. Military. Maybe. Cop." The old inmate shook his head. "No cop I ever met moved like that." Breakfast ended. Steel doors buzzed open. Cell Block C prepared for another ordinary morning. But somewhere deep inside the building, Officer Daniel Brooks watched Elias Carter being escorted down the corridor. Brooks had worked corrections for 22 years. He had seen gang leaders, fugitives, con artists, and decorated veterans who had lost their way. Most people carried fear into prison. Others carried anger. But the man walking toward Cell Block C carried neither. His breathing never changed. His eyes never wandered. They measured distance. Doors. Corners. Exits. Brooks felt a strange chill run down his spine. He had seen that kind of awareness before, many years ago, on a military base overseas where ordinary men were trained to do extraordinary things. The officer looked back at the thin transfer file in his hand, then at the quiet man disappearing around the corner. Something wasn't adding up, and before the day was over, the entire prison was about to understand exactly why. The steel door to Cell Block C slid open with a low mechanical hum that echoed through the corridor, and every conversation seemed to slow for just a second. Elias Carter stepped inside, carrying the same clear bag he had walked off the transport bus with, his expression unchanged, his pace steady, neither fast nor slow. Most new transfers made the same mistake. They looked around too much. They searched for friendly faces or obvious threats. Elias did neither. He simply walked forward as though he had already accepted whatever waited for him. Officer Daniel Brooks followed several steps behind, watching more carefully than he wanted to admit. 22 years in corrections had taught him to trust small details. The way a man stood, the way he carried weight, the way his eyes moved without moving his head. Elias was not studying the block out of fear. He was mapping it. Brooks had seen soldiers do that overseas, long before he traded military contracts for prison walls. The realization made him uneasy. Inside the common area, the usual morning routine continued. Some inmates played cards. Others watched an old television hanging from the wall. A few sat alone with books or letters from home. But one table naturally pulled attention away from everything else. Tommy Graves leaned back in his chair with one boot resting on the bench across from him, surrounded by the same small circle that followed him everywhere. Nobody had appointed Tommy to run the block. Tom had done that. 8 years of building favors, settling arguments, and convincing everyone that life became easier if they stayed on his good side. One of Tommy's men noticed the new arrival first. He leaned over and spoke quietly. Tommy glanced toward the entrance. His grin appeared almost instantly. "That is him?" he asked. "That is the transfer." Tommy looked Elias up and down. The gray around his hair, the calm face, the plain expression. Then he laughed softly. "Looks like somebody's uncle got lost on the way to bingo night." The men around him laughed with him. A few other inmates joined in, mostly because it felt safer than staying quiet. Elias kept walking. He did not speed up. He did not slow down. He passed within a few feet of Tommy's table without turning his head once. That was unusual. Around Red Creek, everyone acknowledged Tommy sooner or later, even if it was only a nervous glance. Tommy watched the new man continue toward the empty tables near the back wall. The smile on his face faded just a little. "Did he not hear me?" he asked. One of his friends shrugged. "Maybe he is scared." Tommy looked again. "No," he said quietly. "That is not fear." Across the room, an older inmate named Walter Jenkins lowered his newspaper. Walter had spent almost 3 decades moving through different prisons, and surviving that long required paying attention. He watched Elias sit down and place his small bag beside the chair. The new transfer folded his hands together for a moment and simply looked out the narrow window near the ceiling. Walter frowned. "You ever see that before?" he whispered to the man beside him. "See what?" "A new guy acting like he already belongs here." The other inmate shook his head. Officer Brooks walked past Elias and stopped just long enough to speak in a low voice. "You need anything, Carter?" Elias looked up politely. "No, sir. I am fine." The answer was simple, respectful, controlled. Brooks nodded and continued walking, but the conversation stayed in his mind. Most transfers asked about schedules, cells, or commissary rules. Elias had asked for nothing. 10 minutes later, another inmate approached the empty table carrying his breakfast tray. He looked young, maybe 24, with nervous eyes that had not adjusted to prison life. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked. Elias gave a small nod. "Seat is open. Name is Marcus Hill." "Elias." Marcus smiled awkwardly. "People usually tell you to stay away from that table over there." He tilted his head toward Tommy. Elias glanced once and then looked back at his untouched coffee. "I figured." Marcus waited for another question, but none came. The silence stretched until Marcus finally laughed under his breath. "You really do not talk much." Elias looked out the window again, where the morning sun touched the outer fence. "Most problems start because people talk too much." Walter heard that from across the room. So did Tommy Graves. And for reasons neither of them could explain, the entire block suddenly felt a little quieter than before. Officer Daniel Brooks had worked long enough to know that silence could tell a bigger story than words ever could. As the morning slowly moved toward noon, he found himself watching the security monitors more often than usual. Camera 12 showed the common area. Camera 14 covered the hallway leading to the library. Camera 16 overlooked the small recreation yard surrounded by chain-link fences and aging concrete walls. On every screen, life inside Red Creek followed the same rhythm it always had. Men walked in circles. Some argued over card games. Others stared into the distance as if looking through the walls instead of at them. But one figure stood apart from the rest. Elias Carter had not spoken to anyone except the young inmate, who introduced himself as Marcus Hill. He had not asked questions. He had not tried to make friends. He simply moved through the day with a calm that felt almost unnatural inside a place built from tension. Brooks reached for the transfer file one more time. There had to be something missing. He opened the folder again. Name, age, physical description, court documents, transfer authorization. That was all. No psychological notes. No disciplinary history. No military background. No employment records. It was as though somebody had erased an entire lifetime and left behind only enough paper to move a man from one prison to another. The older officer frowned. People did not arrive with empty histories. Not in his experience. Across the block, Tommy Graves sat with his crew watching the new transfer through the cafeteria windows. One of the younger gang members laughed quietly. Maybe he is just old. Tommy did not answer. He kept looking at Elias walking alone along the recreation track, one slow lap after another. You ever notice something? Tommy finally asked. What? He never looks nervous. The others shrugged. Maybe he is trying to act tough. Tommy shook his head. No. Men pretending to be tough always look around to see who is watching. He pointed toward the yard. That guy does not care who is watching. The words settled over the table. A few of the older inmates nearby pretended not to listen, but they heard every syllable. Walter Jenkins folded his newspaper and leaned back against the wall. He had survived enough prisons to recognize patterns. New inmates usually spent their first day trying to understand the rules. Elias Carter acted like he had already seen every rule that mattered. Out in the yard, Marcus Hill caught up to him after nearly jogging half the distance. Mind if I walk? He asked, breathing a little harder than he expected. Elias gave a small nod. The two men continued around the cracked pavement without speaking for several moments. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. People are talking about you already. Elias looked ahead. People always talk. Marcus smiled. Tommy usually makes new guys introduce themselves. I know. You know? Elias glanced toward the cafeteria windows where Tommy and his crew could barely be seen behind the glass. I noticed. Marcus waited for more, but nothing came. You are not worried? Elias looked up at the pale blue sky above the fences. Worry does not change what is coming. The young inmate blinked. You always talk like that. A faint smile touched the corner of Elias's face. No. Only when somebody asks the right question. Back inside the administration office, Brooks closed the transfer file and walked toward the records room. An old civilian clerk looked up from her desk. Need something? Brooks placed the folder in front of her. Run another search. She adjusted her glasses. I already checked. This is everything. Check federal records. She looked surprised. Federal? Brooks nodded slowly. Humor me. The woman typed for nearly a minute. Then her fingers stopped moving. The color slowly faded from her face. That is strange. Brooks stepped closer. What is it? She turned the monitor toward him. Instead of a file, a single line appeared across the screen. Access restricted. Authorization level required. Brooks stared at the message without speaking. In 22 years, he had never seen a prison transfer attached to a locked federal archive. At that exact moment, across the yard, Tommy Graves stood up from his table and slowly started walking toward the exit doors. Every member of his crew followed without saying a word. Walter Jenkins watched them leave and quietly folded his newspaper one last time. Then he whispered to himself, they are about to find out something they should have left alone. The recreation yard slowly emptied as the afternoon count approached, but the feeling hanging over cell block C refused to disappear. Small conversations faded whenever Elias Carter walked past. Men who had ignored him that morning now watched from a distance, pretending not to. Rumors had already started doing what rumors always did inside prison walls. One inmate claimed the new transfer had once worked for the government. Another swore he had been a police detective. Someone else insisted he had spent 20 years protecting foreign diplomats. Nobody knew the truth, but the mystery itself seemed to grow larger every hour. Marcus Hill sat beside Elias on one of the old concrete benches facing the fence. The younger inmate kept looking around before finally speaking. You know they are talking about you. Elias kept his eyes on the yard. People need stories to make long days shorter. Marcus laughed quietly. You really are different. Elias looked at him for the first time. Different is not always a good thing. Before Marcus could answer, the loudspeaker called for afternoon movement. Groups of inmates headed back inside, while officers guided the lines with practiced routine. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the entrance, but his attention was somewhere else. The message on the federal database still echoed in his mind. Access restricted. Authorization level required. He had spent the last hour trying to convince himself there had been some kind of mistake. Maybe the system was old. Maybe the file had been corrupted. But deep down he knew better. Some records were hidden because they mattered. As the line moved forward, Brooks stopped Elias with a simple gesture. Carter. Elias turned calmly. Yes, sir. Brooks hesitated for a moment. Have we met before? Marcus looked surprised by the question. Elias simply studied the older officer with quiet patience. I do not think so. Brooks nodded, but something about the answer bothered him. The voice, the posture, the eyes that never seemed rushed. He had seen men like that once during a security assignment years ago. Men who spoke softly because they never needed to raise their voices. Elias continued walking, leaving Brooks standing alone with more questions than answers. Inside the block, Tommy Graves was waiting. His crew had gathered around the center table again, but this time the laughter was gone. Tommy watched the new transfer enter the room and sit at the same empty table near the back wall. Still ignoring you, one of his men muttered. Tommy folded his arms. No, no. He is measuring us. The younger inmate frowned. Why would he do that? Tommy did not answer right away. He had spent years reading people. Fear had a look. Anger had a look. Pride had a look. But Elias Carter carried none of them. It reminded Tommy of something his father had once told him before prison changed both of their lives. The quiet dog in the yard was usually the one that had already won every fight that mattered. Tommy pushed the thought away. He did not like the feeling settling in his stomach. Across the room, Walter Jenkins slowly walked over to Elias carrying a cup of coffee. Several inmates watched in surprise. Walter almost never approached newcomers. He placed the cup on the table. House blend is terrible, he said. But it is a little better while it is still warm. Elias looked at the old man and nodded politely. Thank you. Walter lowered himself into the chair across from him. You remind me of somebody I knew a long time ago. Elias remained silent. Walter smiled. That man used to say that the loudest person in the room was usually trying to hide something. A faint expression crossed Elias's face, almost too small to notice. Smart man. Walter leaned closer. He also said that real strength never announces itself. For the first time all day, Elias looked directly into another man's eyes. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Around them, the noise of the block seemed to disappear. Walter finally stood up and picked up his empty cup. Be careful, he said quietly. Tommy does not like mysteries. Elias watched him walk away before answering under his breath. Neither do I. At the center table, Tommy Graves had seen the entire exchange. He stood up slowly, straightened his shirt, and looked toward his crew. Tomorrow morning, he said, I am going to introduce myself properly. Nobody noticed Officer Brooks standing behind the security glass, watching the same scene unfold. And nobody inside Red Creek realized that somewhere in a locked federal archive, a file connected to Elias Carter had just been opened by someone far outside the prison walls. Morning arrived with the same gray light that always slipped through the narrow windows of Red Creek. But something inside cell block C had changed. Nobody said it out loud. They did not have to. Men who had ignored Elias Carter the day before now watched him from the corners of their eyes. The rumors had grown overnight. One version claimed he had worked for the government. Another said he had protected presidents. Someone even whispered that he had once disappeared for 3 years without leaving a single record behind. Walter Jenkins had heard every story and believed none of them. In prison, truth usually hid somewhere between silence and exaggeration. Elias walked into the cafeteria exactly as he had the day before. Calm, unhurried, carrying his tray with both hands. Marcus Hill spotted him immediately and waved him toward the back table. I saved you a seat, he said. Elias nodded once. Thank you. Before either man could sit down, the entire room seemed to grow quieter. Tommy Graves stood up from his table. His crew followed without needing instructions. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor drew everyone's attention. Even the guards near the entrance noticed the shift in the atmosphere. Officer Daniel Brooks looked through the window from the control station and felt the same uneasy feeling return. Tommy walked across the cafeteria at an easy pace, stopping a few feet from Elias. The two men looked completely different. Tommy carried himself like someone used to being the center of attention. Elias looked like a man who had spent his life avoiding it. You are the new transfer, Tommy said. Elias met his eyes. That is what they tell me. A few inmates laughed quietly. Tommy smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Funny. Most people introduce themselves when they arrive. Elias glanced at the empty chair beside Marcus. I was planning to eat breakfast first. The answer was so calm that several older inmates exchanged nervous looks. Tommy folded his arms. Maybe you do not understand how things work around here. Elias looked around the room for a moment. Looks like breakfast starts at 7. A few more quiet laughs spread through the cafeteria before disappearing just as quickly. Tommy's crew did not look amused. Marcus Hill lowered his eyes toward his tray. Walter Jenkins slowly put down his coffee cup. Officer Brooks reached for the radio on his belt, but did not press the button. Something told him to wait. Tommy stepped a little closer. You think you are different? Elias answered without changing his expression. No, then why act like the rules do not apply to you? Elias looked at him carefully before speaking. Because I have learned that some rules matter more than others. The words hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Tommy studied the older man for several long seconds. He had expected fear. He had expected excuses. Maybe even anger. Instead, he found something that confused him. Peace. The kind of peace that did not need permission from anyone else. Walter Jenkins quietly shook his head. He had seen that look once before many years ago in another prison, worn by a decorated Marine who had survived 2 wars and somehow feared nothing inside concrete walls. Tommy finally stepped back with a small laugh. Maybe you will fit in after all. Elias picked up his tray again. Maybe. Tommy turned and walked back toward his table, but the victory he expected did not come. The room did not laugh with him. The room stayed silent. Marcus looked at Elias with wide eyes. I thought that was going to go very differently. Elias sat down and unfolded his napkin. Most people think that. Across the cafeteria, Officer Brooks slowly lowered his hand from the radio. Then he looked through the glass at the quiet man eating breakfast as though nothing unusual had happened. The old officer could not explain it, but he suddenly remembered a briefing from years ago during a military contract. The instructor had said that the most disciplined operators were almost impossible to provoke because they had already mastered the hardest battle of all, the battle with themselves. Brooks looked down at the restricted transfer file one more time. For the first time since it had arrived on his desk, he was no longer wondering what Elias Carter had done before prison. He was starting to wonder what kind of world could create a man like him in the first place. By late afternoon, the ordinary sounds of Red Creek had returned, but the balance inside cell block C had shifted in ways most people could not explain. Men still played cards. The television still filled the room with old reruns and local news. The officers still walked their routes with the same careful routine. Yet every conversation seemed to stop whenever Elias Carter crossed the common area. Nobody understood why. They only knew that the new transfer had stood in front of Tommy Graves without trying to impress anyone and without showing the slightest sign of fear. Marcus Hill followed Elias toward the library after the evening meal. It was one of the quietest places in the prison, a narrow room lined with worn shelves and old paperbacks that had passed through hundreds of hands. Marcus looked around before speaking. Can I ask you something? Elias picked up a history book and glanced at the cover. You already are. Marcus smiled. Were you really in the military? Elias turned a page without answering. Marcus waited. People are saying all kinds of things. Another page turned. Finally, Elias looked up. People usually build stories when they do not have facts. So it is not true. Elias closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. The past is just another place you cannot go back to. Marcus frowned. That is not really an answer. A small smile appeared for only a second. It is the only one I have. Across the building, Officer Daniel Brooks sat alone in the records office. The restricted file was still open on the computer screen. He had called an old friend who used to work with federal agencies, hoping for an explanation. The answer had only made things stranger. His friend had gone quiet after hearing the name Elias Carter. Then he had asked Brooks one question. Why are you looking into that file? Brooks had laughed nervously. He is just an inmate. There had been a long pause. No, the man had finally replied. If that is the same Elias Carter I am thinking about, he was never just anything. Then the line had gone dead. Brooks looked at the screen again. One sentence kept repeating in his mind. He was never just anything. In the common area, Tommy Graves sat with his crew, but he was not listening to the conversation around him. One of his younger followers leaned closer. You let him disrespect you. Tommy looked up slowly. Did I? Everybody saw it. Tommy glanced across the room where Elias and Marcus had just returned from the library. The older man was carrying a single book under his arm. He walked with the same measured pace as always, as though time itself moved differently around him. Tommy narrowed his eyes. Do you know what bothers me? The younger inmate shook his head. He acts like none of this matters. Another man laughed. Maybe prison finally broke him. Tommy did not laugh back. No, then what? Tommy kept watching Elias. Broken people do not stand that straight. Walter Jenkins was sitting close enough to hear every word. He folded his newspaper and quietly stood up. As he walked past Tommy's table, he stopped for just a second. Sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is leave a mystery alone. Tommy looked up at him. You know something? Walter adjusted his glasses. I know that old men usually survive because they learn which doors should stay closed. Then he walked away. The word stayed with Tommy longer than he wanted to admit. That night, after lights out, Marcus lay awake in the top bunk while Elias sat quietly by the narrow window of their cell. Moonlight slipped through the bars, casting long shadows across the floor. Can I ask one last question? Marcus whispered. You can ask. Will you answer? Elias looked at the stars that barely showed through the prison fence. Maybe. Marcus took a slow breath. What scares you? The room stayed silent for several seconds. Finally, Elias spoke so softly that Marcus almost missed it. Watching good people forget who they are. Marcus expected another long speech, but none came. Elias simply stood up and returned to his bunk. Outside, the prison settled into silence. Far beyond the walls, inside a secure government office hundreds of miles away, a sealed file marked Carter, Elias was placed on a conference table. One man looked at the cover and quietly said, After all these years, how did he end up there? No one in the room had an answer. The next morning arrived with a cold rain tapping softly against the narrow windows of Red Creek, covering the prison yard in a thin gray mist that made the fences seem taller than usual. Marcus Hill woke before the morning count and noticed that Elias Carter was already awake. The older man sat quietly on the edge of his bunk, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the small window high above the cell door. He looked less like a prisoner and more like someone waiting for the beginning of an ordinary workday. You ever sleep? Marcus asked with a tired smile. Elias looked over. Enough. Marcus climbed down from the top bunk. I kept thinking about what you said last night. Elias stood and straightened the blanket on his bed with careful precision. Every corner matched perfectly. Every fold looked measured. Marcus watched him for a second. You always make your bed like that. Elias glanced at him. A man should start the day by putting one thing in order. Marcus laughed quietly. My grandfather used to say something like that. Elias gave a small nod, but said nothing else. During breakfast, the atmosphere inside the cafeteria felt heavier than it had the day before. Word had spread that Tommy Graves intended to make the new transfer understand the rules. Nobody knew exactly what that meant, but they all understood the message. Walter Jenkins noticed that the older inmates chose seats farther away from the center tables than usual. Even Officer Daniel Brooks seemed more alert as he walked his morning route. Tommy arrived a few minutes late, surrounded by the same group that followed him everywhere. He looked across the room and immediately found Elias sitting beside Marcus. The new transfer was reading a worn paperback while his breakfast sat untouched. Tommy frowned. Look at him, one of his men whispered. He acts like he owns the place. Tommy slowly shook his head. No, then what is it? Tommy kept watching. He acts like this place cannot touch him. The words unsettled even the men sitting beside him. Across the cafeteria, Marcus leaned closer. You know he is staring at you. Elias calmly turned another page. I know. Does it bother you? No, Marcus looked confused. Why not? Elias closed the book and placed it beside his tray. Because people usually watch the things they do not understand. At that moment, Officer Brooks entered the cafeteria carrying a folder that had arrived from the administration office only minutes earlier. It was not the federal file. That one remained locked away. This was something different. A shipping manifest from the transfer bus. Brooks stopped walking when he noticed a small handwritten note attached to the last page. It had no signature. Only one sentence. Verify the identity before asking questions. Brooks read it twice. The handwriting looked official, but there was no agency seal and no explanation. He slowly looked across the room toward Elias Carter. The older man happened to glance up at exactly the same moment. For 1 second, their eyes met. Brooks felt a strange feeling he had not experienced since his younger days working security contracts overseas. It was the feeling of standing near someone who had already prepared for every possible outcome. Tommy finally stood up from his table. The room became quiet almost immediately. Marcus looked down at his tray. Walter Jenkins folded his newspaper. Several inmates stopped eating altogether. Tommy walked across the cafeteria with slow, confident steps until he reached Elias. This time he did not smile. "You read a lot," he said. Elias looked at the cover of the book in his hands. "Sometimes." Tommy pointed at it. "What is it about?" Elias looked back at him. "History." Tommy laughed once. "You planning to write your own?" Elias thought for a moment before answering. "No, I am trying not to repeat someone else's." The answer was simple, but something about it caused the entire cafeteria to fall completely silent. Tommy stared at him, waiting for fear, waiting for hesitation, waiting for anything that would make sense. Instead, he found the same calm expression that had been there since the first day. Walter Jenkins quietly lowered his eyes. Officer Brooks tightened his grip on the folder. Marcus barely breathed. And somewhere deep inside, Tommy Graves felt a thought he had not experienced in many years. For the first time since he took control of Cell Block C, he was beginning to wonder if he had misunderstood the man sitting across from him. The tension inside Red Creek did not disappear after breakfast. If anything, it grew stronger with every passing hour. Men who had spent years learning how to read danger felt it without understanding why. They could not point to a threat. They could not explain the feeling. They only knew that something about Elias Carter refused to fit the ordinary rules of prison life. The afternoon recreation period arrived, and the yard slowly filled with inmates walking laps beneath the gray sky. Marcus Hill stayed close to Elias, partly because he liked talking to him and partly because he felt safer than he had since arriving at Red Creek. "I have been thinking," Marcus said as they walked beside the fence. "About what?" "About what Officer Brooks asked you." Elias kept his eyes forward. "Which part?" "When he asked if you had met before." Elias was quiet for a moment. People sometimes remember faces from places they would rather forget. Marcus looked confused. "Did you ever work with him?" "No." "Then why did he look at you like that?" Elias glanced toward one of the guard towers. "Because memory is strange." Before Marcus could ask another question, a loud whistle sounded from the far side of the yard. Tommy Graves and several members of his crew were walking toward the track. Nobody spoke, but dozens of eyes followed them. Walter Jenkins sat on a bench near the wall with an old paperback in his lap. He watched Tommy approach and quietly closed the book. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the entrance gate pretending to check paperwork, but his attention never left the group. Tommy stopped directly in front of Elias. The two men stood silently for several seconds while the rest of the yard seemed to freeze around them. Finally, Tommy spoke. "You like walking alone?" Elias looked at him calmly. "I do not mind company." Tommy glanced at Marcus. "Then maybe your friend should give us a minute." Marcus looked at Elias, unsure what to do. Elias simply nodded once. "It is all right." Marcus stepped back, but he did not leave. Neither did Walter. Neither did Brooks. Tommy folded his arms. "I have been trying to figure you out." Elias waited. Most men come in here trying to prove something. Still no answer. Tommy looked almost frustrated. "You do not seem interested in respect." "Respect that has to be demanded usually is not respect," Elias said quietly. Several inmates nearby lowered their heads. Tommy stared at him. "You think you are wiser than everybody else?" Elias shook his head. "No, then what makes you so calm?" Elias looked across the yard toward the outer fence where a small bird had landed on the wire. "Experience." Tommy followed his gaze. "Experience doing what?" The older man watched the bird take flight. "Learning that fear is usually louder than truth." The words settled over the yard like the cold wind that had started to move through the fences. Tommy wanted another answer, something he could understand, something he could use, but the calm expression never changed. It was the same look Elias had worn since stepping off the transport bus. Officer Brooks felt his radio vibrate on his belt. He stepped aside and answered quietly. The voice on the other end was the same federal contact he had spoken to the night before. "Brooks," the man said, "whatever you do, do not push him." Brooks frowned. "Push who?" The caller was silent for a second. "You already know who I mean." "Who is he?" Another pause followed. "A long time ago, there were people whose names never appeared in newspapers because the work they did could not exist in public. Sometimes those people disappear. Sometimes they try to become ordinary again." Brooks looked across the yard at Elias. "And if they cannot?" The answer came softly. "Then they carry the past with them forever." The line went dead. Brooks lowered the radio slowly. Across the yard, Tommy Graves took one last look at the quiet man standing in front of him. For reasons he could not explain, He suddenly felt that every story he had heard over the last 2 days might actually be too small. And somewhere deep inside, a question he had been trying to ignore finally became impossible to silence. Who exactly had walked into his prison? That evening the rain finally stopped, leaving the prison yard covered in shallow puddles that reflected the floodlights above the fences. Red Creek usually became quieter after dinner, but not that night. The conversations had changed. Men were no longer asking whether Elias Carter was different. They were asking how different. Marcus Hill noticed it first while they walked back toward their cell. Inmates who had ignored them before now stepped aside without being asked. A few gave polite nods. Others simply looked away. Something is changing, Marcus said quietly. Elias carried the same paperback under his arm. Everything changes. No, I mean around you. Elias looked toward the long corridor ahead. People see what they want to see. Marcus shook his head. I do not think that is true anymore. As they entered the common area, Walter Jenkins was sitting by the window reading his newspaper. He folded it carefully and motioned for Marcus to come closer. The younger inmate looked surprised. Walter almost never invited anyone to sit with him. Marcus glanced at Elias. The older man gave a small nod and walked toward the bookshelves. Walter waited until he was out of earshot. You trust him? Marcus answered without hesitation. Yes. Walter looked through the window where Elias stood quietly reading the titles on the shelves. Good. Marcus frowned. Why? Walter took a slow breath. Because there are some people who spend their whole lives learning how to survive terrible places, and when they finally find a little peace, the world has a habit of testing them one last time. Marcus looked back at Elias. You know who he is, do not you? Walter smiled faintly. No, then why do you talk like that? Walter looked down at his folded newspaper. Because I knew somebody once who carried himself the same way. He had been through things he never talked about. One day I asked him how he stayed so calm. Marcus leaned forward. What did he say? Walter's eyes drifted toward the quiet man standing alone by the bookshelves. He told me that panic wastes time, and time is the one thing you never get back. Across the room, Tommy Graves watched the conversation from his usual table. He had not taken his eyes off Elias for more than a few seconds all evening. One of his men sat down beside him. You still thinking about him? Tommy nodded. Something is wrong. Wrong how? Tommy looked around the block. Look at everybody. The younger inmate did. The older prisoners stayed quiet. The officers seemed more alert. Even Walter Jenkins had spoken to the new transfer. I do not get it, the younger man admitted. Tommy folded his arms. Neither do I. At the security office, Officer Daniel Brooks sat with the mysterious transfer file in front of him. He had not planned to open it again, but the words from his federal contact would not leave his mind. Some people disappear. Some people try to become ordinary again. Brooks quietly opened the folder and noticed something he had missed before. A small number was printed in the bottom corner of one page. It looked like an inventory code rather than a prison record. Curious, he entered it into the secure database. The screen stayed blank for several seconds. Then a single sentence appeared. Record archived under Defense Authority. Access denied. Brooks leaned back in his chair. Defense Authority. He whispered the words to himself. Red Creek had housed former police officers, military veterans, and government employees before, but never anyone whose file belonged to another world entirely. A loud buzzer signaled final evening count. Inmates slowly returned to their cells. Marcus climbed into the top bunk and looked down at Elias. Can I ask you one more thing? Elias sat on the lower bunk, setting his book beside him. You can ask. Marcus smiled. Did you ever dream about having a normal life? The older man looked toward the narrow window where the moon had finally broken through the clouds. He stayed silent for so long that Marcus thought he would not answer. Then he spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper. Every day. Marcus nodded. Then why does it feel like you never got one? Elias looked back at him with a quiet sadness that had not been there before. Because sometimes the things you do for other people follow you home. Neither man spoke again. Outside the cell, Officer Brooks finished locking the final gate for the night. Across the block, Tommy Graves lay awake staring at the ceiling. Walter Jenkins closed his eyes with a heavy sigh. And somewhere far away, inside a government building with no signs outside and no names on the doors, a gray-haired official looked at an old photograph of a younger Elias Carter standing beside a helicopter in a distant desert. The man touched the picture lightly and said, I hope they never force you to remember who you used to be. The next day began with bright sunlight cutting across the prison yard, washing away the last traces of the storm. Red Creek looked almost peaceful from a distance, but the men living behind its walls knew better. Places like this never stayed quiet for long. Marcus Hill walked beside Elias Carter toward the work detail assignment board. The younger inmate had noticed something unusual that morning. Tommy Graves was not laughing with his crew. He was watching. Every movement Elias made seemed to hold his attention. "I do not think he is going to let this go," Marcus whispered. Elias glanced at the assignment board. "Most people do not let go of questions. You are not worried?" Elias looked at him calmly. "No," Marcus sighed. "I wish I knew how you do that." Elias folded the small paper, showing his work assignment. "Calm is just practice." The two men were assigned to the prison maintenance building, a large concrete structure where inmates repaired furniture, cleaned equipment, and organized supplies for the different blocks. It was quieter than the cafeteria and far away from most of the daily noise. Officer Daniel Brooks checked the roster and frowned. Tommy Graves and two members of his crew had also been assigned to the same area. Brooks looked up toward the control booth. "Who changed this?" The clerk shrugged. "Orders came through this morning." Brooks felt a familiar sense of unease. He almost asked for the paperwork, but something stopped him. He had already learned that questions connected to Elias Carter rarely brought simple answers. Inside the maintenance building, rows of shelves stretched toward the ceiling. Old tables, storage lockers, and repair stations filled the room. Sunlight slipped through the high windows, leaving long shadows across the floor. Elias quietly picked up his assignment sheet and started organizing a stack of supply boxes. Marcus worked nearby, still stealing nervous glances toward the entrance. A few minutes later, Tommy Graves walked in with his crew. Nobody spoke. The entire building seemed to grow still. Walter Jenkins, who had been assigned to paint old cabinets, slowly set his brush down. Even the officers supervising the work detail seemed to notice the change in the atmosphere. Tommy walked through the aisles until he reached Elias. The older man never looked up from the boxes he was arranging. "You always work this hard?" Tommy asked. Elias placed another box on the shelf. "It passes the time." Tommy looked around the building. "You know, everybody around here has a story." Elias nodded slightly. "That is true, but nobody seems to know yours." Elias finally looked at him. "Maybe that is because it is not very interesting." Tommy laughed softly. "I do not believe that." Marcus stopped working. Walter Jenkins quietly watched from the far side of the room. Officer Brooks stepped closer without making it obvious. Tommy reached toward one of the supply boxes sitting beside Elias and picked it up. He looked at the label and smiled. "Heavy." Elias simply held out his hand. "Careful. Those are glass parts." Tommy looked at the box for a second before handing it back. "You know something?" Elias waited. "I think you have been playing a game with everybody here." The older man carefully placed the box back on the shelf. "No, then what are you doing?" Elias looked around the quiet building before answering. "Trying to finish my work." Tommy stared at him, searching for something hidden behind the calm expression. Pride, anger, fear, anything. But there was nothing there except patience. Walter Jenkins slowly smiled to himself. He had been right all along. The quietest man in the room was carrying the heaviest story. Officer Brooks felt the radio on his belt vibrate again. He stepped into the hallway and answered. The same federal voice spoke without introduction. "Has he caused any problems?" Brooks looked back through the window at Elias stacking boxes with perfect care. "No. Has anyone tried to cause problems for him?" Brooks hesitated. "Maybe." The voice on the line became very quiet. "Then do yourself a favor, Officer Brooks." "What?" "Make sure they remember that some people spend their whole lives avoiding conflict because they know exactly what it costs." The call ended. Brooks lowered the radio and looked through the glass once more. Inside the building, Tommy Graves was still standing in front of Elias Carter. But for the first time since becoming the king of Cell Block C, he looked like a man who was no longer completely certain he understood the game he was playing. The maintenance building stayed quiet after the conversation ended, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer the ordinary silence of men doing their work. It was the kind that comes before a storm, when everyone feels that something important is about to happen even if nobody can explain why. Elias Carter returned to organizing the shelves exactly as he had before, one box after another, one careful movement at a time. His breathing never changed. His expression never changed. Marcus Hill watched him for several minutes before finally walking over. "How do you do that?" he asked. Elias looked up. "Do what?" "Act like none of this bothers you." Elias glanced toward the high windows where the afternoon sun was beginning to fade. "A long time ago somebody taught me that you only have so much energy every day." Marcus waited. "If you waste it worrying about things you cannot control, you will have nothing left for the things that matter." Marcus nodded slowly. "Who taught you that?" Elias looked back at the shelves. "A good man." Across the room, Tommy Graves pretended to sort tools while quietly watching the conversation. One of his men stepped beside him. "I still do not trust him." Tommy folded his arms. "Neither do I. Want us to find out what his story is." Tommy looked at Elias for a long moment. "I think he is waiting for somebody to ask the wrong question." The younger inmate laughed nervously. "You really believe all those rumors?" Tommy did not answer. He simply kept watching. Officer Daniel Brooks entered the building carrying a clipboard. He walked through the workstations, checking names and assignments. But his eyes stopped when he reached Elias. "Everything all right here?" he asked. Elias nodded. "Yes, sir." Brooks hesitated. "You worked around equipment before?" Elias looked at the organized shelves behind him. "A little." Brooks glanced at the perfect rows of supplies. Every label faced forward. Every box sat exactly where it belonged. Nothing was out of place. Brooks had seen military storage rooms that looked less organized than this. He quietly marked something on the clipboard and moved on. Walter Jenkins noticed it too. The old inmate slowly walked over carrying a paintbrush. "You know," he said, "most people throw things onto shelves because they know somebody else will clean it up later." Elias smiled faintly. "Small things become habits." Walter nodded. "And habits become character." Elias looked at him. "That is what I was taught." Walter studied the older man for a second before speaking again. "The man who taught you, was he family?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "No, a soldier." Another pause followed. Finally, Elias answered. "A teacher." Walter did not ask anything else. Somehow that simple answer felt bigger than the question. The afternoon whistle signaled the end of work detail. Inmates lined up to return to their blocks. Marcus stood beside Elias while Tommy and his crew waited several places behind them. Nobody spoke during the walk back through the long concrete hallway. The only sounds were footsteps and the distant buzz of security doors opening and closing. As they reached the entrance to cell block C, Officer Brooks felt his radio vibrate once more. He stepped aside and answered quietly. The same federal voice returned. "I have one question for you." Brooks lowered his eyes. "Go ahead. Has he lost his temper yet?" Brooks looked through the security glass at Elias walking calmly beside Marcus. "No," the voice seemed almost relieved. "Good." Brooks frowned. "You keep asking me about him, but you still have not told me who he is." The caller remained silent for several seconds. Then he finally spoke. "Some people spend their lives protecting strangers without ever expecting to be remembered. If you are lucky, Officer Brooks, that is all you will ever need to know." The line disconnected. Brooks slowly put the radio away. Inside the block, evening count began. Elias sat on his bunk reading while Marcus cleaned the small table beneath the window. Tommy Graves stood across the room pretending not to watch. Walter Jenkins quietly folded another newspaper. Nobody noticed the small envelope that had just arrived in the warden's office from Washington. On the front was only one sentence printed in black letters. "Do not release sealed service records under any circumstances." The envelope from Washington stayed on Warden Richard Collins's desk for nearly an hour before he finally opened it. Men in his position received unusual paperwork from time to time, but this felt different. There was no agency seal, no department logo, and no signature. Inside was a single page containing only 3 lines. Maintain current housing assignment. Do not request military records. Do not discuss inmate Elias Carter with outside media or personnel. Collins read the page twice before setting it down. In 20 years of running correctional facilities, he had never received instructions quite like that. Across the prison, Officer Daniel Brooks stood in the observation booth overlooking cell block C. The mysterious calls, the restricted files, and now the sealed orders had created more questions than answers. He watched Elias sitting alone at one of the common tables with the same old paperback resting in front of him. Marcus Hill was beside him, talking about life before prison, about his younger sister, about the old pickup truck he wanted to rebuild someday after he got out. Elias listened carefully, never interrupting, never trying to change the subject. You ever think about what you are going to do when you leave here? Marcus asked. Elias looked out the narrow window where the afternoon sunlight touched the fence. Find somewhere quiet. Marcus smiled. That is it. That is enough. Marcus laughed softly. You really do not ask for much. Elias looked back at him. Most people spend their lives chasing things they do not need. Nearby, Walter Jenkins folded another newspaper and quietly watched the conversation. The old inmate had begun noticing something else about Elias. Younger prisoners naturally gathered around him, not because he demanded respect, but because they seemed calmer when he was nearby. Arguments ended quicker. Voices stayed lower. Even officers appeared less tense during his work assignments. Walter had lived long enough to understand that true authority rarely announced itself. Tommy Graves noticed it too. Sitting at his usual table, he watched Marcus laugh at something Elias had said. Another inmate joined them for a few minutes. Then another. Nobody treated Elias like a leader, yet people kept drifting toward him anyway. One of Tommy's men leaned closer. You see that? Tommy nodded. I see it. You should stop it before everybody forgets who runs this block. Tommy did not answer right away. He kept watching the quiet man by the window. Finally he spoke. The strange thing is, I do not think he wants anything from anybody. The younger inmate frowned. Then why are they listening to him? Tommy looked away. Maybe because he listens to them first. The answer surprised even Tommy himself. In the administration office, Officer Brooks finally decided to ask Warden Collins about the sealed orders. He knocked once and stepped inside. Collins slid the paper into a drawer before Brooks reached the desk. Something wrong? The warden asked. Brooks hesitated. Sir, have you ever seen a transfer handled like this? Collins looked at him carefully. No. Do you know who Elias Carter really is? The warden slowly leaned back in his chair. I know exactly as much as you do. Brooks waited. Collins sighed quietly. But I have learned something over the years. What is that? When people with that much authority ask you not to dig any deeper, there is usually a reason. Brooks left the office carrying more uncertainty than before. As evening approached, the inmates returned to the yard for one final walk before count. The sky above Texas had turned orange, and long shadows stretched across the cracked pavement. Marcus walked beside Elias in silence until he finally spoke. Can I tell you something? Elias nodded. I used to think strength meant making people afraid of you. Elias looked toward the horizon. And now? Marcus smiled a little. Now I think it might mean not needing to. Elias did not answer immediately. A flock of birds crossed above the outer fence, disappearing into the distance. Then he quietly said, that took some people a lifetime to understand. From across the yard, Tommy Graves watched the two men walking side by side. For the first time since Elias arrived, Tommy was no longer trying to figure out what the new transfer had done before prison. He was trying to understand why someone who had every reason to be angry had chosen peace instead. And somewhere inside a locked archive far from Red Creek, an old photograph rested on a metal table beneath a single light. In the picture, a much younger Elias Carter stood with several other men whose faces had been blurred before the file was sealed forever. Written across the bottom was one sentence. Some missions end. The people who survive them never truly come home. The weeks that followed changed Red Creek in quiet ways that no report would ever mention. The walls were the same. The fences still stood beneath the Texas sky. The routines never changed. Count, meals, work detail, lockdown. Yet the people inside those walls had begun to change. Marcus Hill noticed it first. The arguments in the common area ended faster. The younger inmates spent more time in the library than around the card tables. Even the officers seemed less tense during evening count. One afternoon, Marcus sat beside Elias Carter near the window and smiled. You know something? Elias looked up from his old paperback. What? You never tried to lead anybody. Elias closed the book and rested it on the table. That was never my job. Marcus looked around the block where several inmates were talking quietly instead of shouting across the room. Funny thing is, I think you did anyway. Elias did not answer. He simply watched the sunlight fall across the floor. Across the room, Tommy Graves sat alone at the table that had once been the center of his world. His crew still followed him, but something had changed in the way they looked at him. Fear had become respect, and respect had become choice. Tommy slowly stood up and walked across the block. Conversation stopped. Marcus looked nervous, but Elias remained exactly as he always was. Calm. Tommy stopped beside the table. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Tommy held out his hand. "I think I got you wrong." Marcus looked shocked. Walter Jenkins lowered his newspaper. Even Officer Daniel Brooks paused in the hallway outside the security glass. Elias stood and shook Tommy's hand. "That happens sometimes." Tommy let out a quiet laugh. "I kept thinking you came here to prove something." Elias shook his head. "No, then why stay quiet?" Elias looked around the prison block one last time. "Because I spent enough years living where noise solved nothing." Tommy nodded slowly. "Were the stories true?" Elias smiled just enough for Marcus to notice. Stories usually become bigger every time they are told. Tommy understood that he would never receive another answer, and strangely, he no longer needed one. He walked back to his table without another word. Walter Jenkins folded his newspaper and whispered to himself, "The strongest men never have to explain who they are." A few days later, Officer Brooks was called into the warden's office. Richard Collins handed him a sealed envelope. This came from Washington. Brooks looked at the label. It was the same plain paper, the same missing signature. Inside was a single document authorizing the permanent destruction of every restricted record connected to Elias Carter's former service. At the bottom was one handwritten sentence: "Let the man have his peace." Brooks stared at the page for a long moment before quietly placing it back into the envelope. That evening, after final count, Marcus sat on the lower bunk while Elias packed the few things he owned into the same clear bag he had carried through the prison gates. "You are leaving tomorrow," Marcus said softly. Elias nodded. "Looks that way." Marcus looked down at the floor. "I wish I could have known who you really were." Elias placed the old paperback into the bag and zipped it closed. "You do?" Marcus looked confused. "I do." Elias smiled. "I am just a man who made mistakes, tried to help where he could, and hoped the world would be a little better when he left." The younger inmate felt his eyes begin to water. "That sounds like a hero to me." Elias gently shook his head. "No, then what?" Elias looked through the small window where the first stars had appeared above the fence. "Just someone who finally learned that the hardest battles are not fought against other people." The next morning, the transport bus rolled through the outer gate exactly as it had the day he arrived. Marcus stood at the window watching it disappear down the long, empty road. Walter Jenkins stood beside him. Officer Brooks watched from the tower above. Even Tommy Graves stepped outside to see the bus leave. None of them knew exactly what Elias Carter had done before he came to Red Creek. They never learned what missions he survived or what burdens he carried. But every one of them remembered the same lesson after he was gone. The quietest person in the room is not always hiding weakness. Sometimes he is protecting the peace he spent a lifetime earning.